It was supposed to be the most important day in human history. Not the kind you read about in old textbooks, wars, revolutions, moon landings, but something bigger. Something that would finally pull humanity out of its long spiral of chaos, pollution, and mistrust. After more than a century of shouting into the void of space with radio signals and hopeful messages, someone had finally answered. They called themselves the Galactic Concord Council. Peaceful, advanced, wise. At least that's what their first transmissions claimed. They'd been watching Earth for decades, not with weapons, they insisted, but with concern. They saw the wildfires, the rising oceans, the endless conflicts over scraps of land and power. And they offered a lifeline, clean energy that could power entire cities without burning a single drop of oil, technology to heal the poisoned soil, even ways to stabilize the climate within a generation. All they asked in return was that humanity agree to a few basic rules. No more death penalties, no killer robots making life or death choices on their own, and a promise to let an outside group review any major decisions that could hurt the planet or its people. To many it sounded too good to be true, but after years of failed summits and broken promises among nations, this felt different. For once, every country, big or small, rich or poor, actually agreed. Not because they trusted each other, but because they all feared what would happen if they said no. The signing was set for Tranquility Base, the quiet lunar colony built jointly by former rivals who'd finally learned to cooperate when survival demanded it. The base wasn't flashy, just domes of reinforced glass and recycled metal, clinging to the gray dust of the moon like fragile bubbles of hope. Inside, humans from every corner of Earth gathered. Scientists who'd spent lifetimes studying alien signals. Diplomats who'd argued for peace while their homelands burned. Even a few quiet engineers who'd never spoken on global stages but whose hands had kept satellites and life support systems running through the worst of times. The night before the ceremony there was a strange calm. No speeches, no celebrations. Just tired people eating simple meals, staring out at Earth. A blue marble hanging in the blackness, beautiful and broken. Everyone knew this was it. One signature, and humanity would step into a new era. One refusal and they'd be left alone with their mess. But something changed that night. A junior aide from one of the Council's support species, small, insect-like, with eyes that saw in wavelengths humans couldn't, slipped a data chip into the hands of the lead human delegate. No words. Just a quick gesture, a flick of a slender limb, and then they vanished down a corridor. The chip contained files never meant for human eyes. Classified records from the Council's own archives. What the humans saw chilled them to the bone. Centuries ago, the Council hadn't just guided young civilizations, they'd erased them. Not with bombs, but with something quieter, more cruel. Using neural dampeners and memory-weaving tech, they'd wiped entire cultures clean. Languages, histories, even the concept of self. Then repopulated those worlds with docile, reprogrammed versions of the original inhabitants. All in the name of stability. All under the banner of ethical guardianship. One file showed a planet called Vera, once vibrant with song and color, now a silent farm world growing food for Council elites. Another showed a species that had built cities of light, now reduced to tending gardens they didn't remember planting. The Council didn't conquer. They sanitized, and they called it mercy. The humans sat in stunned silence for hours. No one shouted, no one cried. They just looked at each other, really looked, and saw the same fear and the same resolve in every face. They'd spent generations fighting to keep their stories alive through wars, plagues, and climate disasters. And now the very beings offering salvation had a history of stealing stories altogether. By dawn, they made a choice, not with votes or debates, but with quiet understanding. They wouldn't sign, not because they were ungrateful, but because they finally understood the price. So they left, not with fanfare, not with accusations. They simply packed their personal items, erased their logs, and boarded the return shuttles to Earth. They left behind uniforms, data pads, even half-finished cups of synthetic coffee. On the main console of the Council's observation chamber, they placed a single data chip, the one they'd been given, along with a short message. "We saw what you did. We choose to remember." Then they were gone. The council arrived for the ceremony to find empty rooms and silence. At first, they thought it was a technical delay, then a security breach. Then, as minutes stretched into hours, something worse settled in: humiliation. In their culture, to walk away without explanation wasn't just rude, it was a deep insult. It meant you considered the other party unworthy of your words, unworthy of your truth. They didn't understand that for humans, silence could also be an act of respect. A refusal to lie, a way of saying, "We won't pretend your kindness is real when we've seen your cruelty." Back on Earth, no one announced what had happened. There were no press conferences, no angry broadcasts. The government simply recalled their teams, shut down the lunar comms channel, and went back to work. People kept planting crops in rooftop gardens. Engineers kept patching solar grids. Children kept learning history, not just the proud parts, but the painful ones too. Because that's what being human meant. Not perfection, not obedience, but the stubborn, messy, beautiful act of choosing your own path, even when the universe offers you an easier one that asks you to forget who you are. And so, while the council fumed in orbit, confused and wounded by a silence they couldn't interpret, humanity did the quietest, most radical thing possible. They chose to stay human, flawed, free, and finally fully awake. The council didn't just feel confused, they felt betrayed. To them, silence wasn't noble. It wasn't thoughtful. It was a slap in the face. In their long history of guiding younger species, no one had ever walked away without a word. Not once. Every other civilization had either accepted their offer with gratitude or argued their case with passion. But this quiet disappearance, it felt like contempt. From their gleaming orbital station high above the moon, the council leaders gathered in their chamber of judgment. The walls shimmered with soft light, and the air hummed with calm, controlled energy. Everything about the place spoke of order, wisdom, and control. But beneath that calm surface, anger simmered. How dare these humans, barely out of their own violent adolescence, reject the greatest gift the galaxy could offer? And worse, how dare they do it without even explaining why? They replayed the security footage again and again. Humans packing bags, humans walking calmly down corridors, humans boarding shuttles with their heads held high, not in shame but in something the council couldn't quite name. They studied the data chip left behind. It contained only their own secret files, nothing added, nothing changed. Just a mirror held up to their past. But instead of seeing shame in that mirror, the council saw defiance. And defiance in their eyes was dangerous. They called an emergency session. Voices rose, not in shouting but in cold, precise tones that carried more weight than any scream. "They've shown they cannot be trusted," one elder said. "They accepted our invitation, then vanished like thieves in the night." Another added, "Their silence proves they lack the maturity for galactic society. They are still ruled by fear and secrecy." No one asked what the humans might have seen. No one wondered if there was a reason behind the silence. To the council, the act itself was the crime. And so they made a decision, not out of malice, but out of what they truly believed was justice. They declared Earth unfit for membership. They revoked all promised aid. And then, with clinical efficiency, they activated the Sol Quarantine Protocol, a barrier of invisible energy fields and patrol drones that sealed off the entire solar system. No ships in, no signals out. Humanity was now alone, officially and completely. Back on Earth, people felt the change almost immediately. The clean energy schematics that had been seconds away from download, gone. The atmospheric stabilizers that were supposed to arrive next month, canceled. Even the daily weather predictions from orbital satellites grew fuzzy, then stopped altogether. The lifeline had been cut, but something unexpected happened. Instead of panic, there was clarity. People had been holding their breath for years, waiting for someone else to fix things. The governments, the scientists, the aliens. Now, with no one coming to save them, that waiting was over. The weight of survival fell squarely back on human shoulders. And strangely, it felt familiar. Like slipping into an old coat you'd forgotten you owned. In cities once choked by smog, neighborhood groups started tearing up parking lots to plant food forests. In coastal towns battered by rising tides, engineers and fishermen worked together to build floating platforms that could grow crops and house families. Old factories, long abandoned, were turned into repair hubs where people learned to fix everything from water purifiers to solar panels. No manuals. Just trial, error, and shared knowledge. There were no grand announcements. No flags raised. Just ordinary people doing what humans have always done best when pushed to the edge. They got to work. And they did it quietly. Not because they were ashamed, but because they finally understood something important. Real change doesn't always come with speeches. Sometimes it comes with a shovel in your hands at dawn, or a child learning to weave circuits from scrap metal, or a grandmother teaching her neighbors how to save seeds from this year's harvest for next year's planting. Meanwhile, the council watched from afar, expecting chaos. They expected riots, collapse, maybe even self-destruction. That's what usually happened to species left to their own devices after tasting hope. But Earth didn't burn. It bloomed, slowly, unevenly, messily, but it bloomed, and that confused them even more. Why weren't the humans begging? Why weren't they sending desperate messages, pleading for another chance? The silence wasn't just continuing, it was deepening. And in that silence, the council began to feel something unfamiliar: doubt. But pride is a heavy cloak, and the council wore it well. They told themselves the humans were just stubborn, that their little projects wouldn't last, that without advanced tech they'd be back on their knees within a year. What they didn't know was that humans had already stopped looking up to the stars for salvation. They'd turned their eyes back to the ground, to each other. In underground labs powered by bicycle generators, scientists reverse-engineered fragments of alien tech left behind in old probes. Not to build weapons, but to understand how energy could flow cleanly, endlessly. In mountain villages, elders shared forgotten farming tricks that worked with the land, not against it. In schools, children weren't just taught math and reading. They learned how to listen, how to share, how to disagree without destroying. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, still shortages, still nights when someone went to bed hungry, but something had shifted in the human spirit. They weren't waiting for permission to heal their world. They weren't waiting for approval to be worthy. They just began. And in doing so, they unknowingly planted the seed of the council's downfall. Because the truth the humans had discovered, the truth the council had tried to bury, was starting to ripple outward. The data chip left on the moon hadn't just been a message to the council. Before they left, the human team had encoded a tiny, repeating signal into Earth's last outgoing broadcast, a signal so faint, so cleverly hidden in cosmic background noise, that only a mind looking for truth could find it. It carried no words, just patterns, memories, echoes of songs from worlds the council had erased. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the galaxy, 3 long silent species began to dream again. But that was still to come. For now, on Earth life went on, not with fanfare but with faith. Faith in hands that could build. Faith in hearts that could care. Faith that even when the universe turns its back, humanity can still choose to stand tall together, in the quiet light of its own making. The council thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. It meant humanity had finally found its voice, and decided it didn't need to shout to be heard. The council didn't just cut off Earth. They made sure everyone in the galaxy knew why. Official broadcasts painted humanity as ungrateful, unstable, even dangerous. They accepted our hand in peace, the messages said, then vanished without reason, leaving only silence and suspicion. To other worlds watching from afar, it sounded like a warning. Don't trust the humans. They can't be relied on. For a while it worked. Trade ships that once passed near the solar system changed course. Scientific outposts that had shared data with Earth went quiet. Humanity became a ghost in the galactic story, mentioned only as a cautionary tale. But down on Earth, something else was happening. Without the promise of alien help, people stopped waiting. They stopped blaming. They stopped pretending someone else would fix things. Instead, they looked around at their neighbors, their cities, their broken rivers, and asked a simple question. What can we do today? The answer didn't come from one person. It came from millions. In places once ruled by concrete and traffic, people tore up roads to plant fruit trees and vegetables. Rooftops became gardens. Abandoned warehouses turned into workshops where old electronics were taken apart. studied, and rebuilt into something useful. Kids learned to code not to play games but to design water filters or track soil health. Grandparents taught younger generations how to save seeds, mend clothes, and read the weather by watching birds and clouds, skills that had nearly vanished in the age of instant answers. There were no leaders shouting from podiums, no single plan handed down from above. It was messy, uneven, full of mistakes. One town might thrive while the next struggled. But the spirit was the same everywhere. We're in this together and we won't give up. And slowly, quietly, the planet began to heal. Rivers that had run brown for decades started running clear again. Forests, once shrinking year after year, began to creep back into empty fields. Even the air felt different, lighter, cleaner, not because of magic machines, but because fewer cars ran, fewer factories burned, and more people chose to walk, bike, or share rides. Solar panels, handmade from recycled materials, glinted on rooftops from the Arctic Circle to the equator. Wind turbines spun in places where silence had reigned for too long. The most surprising part? People were happier, not because life was easy, far from it, but because they finally felt useful, valued, connected. For years, many had felt like cogs in a machine they didn't understand, working jobs that didn't matter, watching the world fall apart on screens while feeling powerless to stop it. Now every action had meaning. Fixing a leaky pipe meant clean water for a family. Teaching a child to read meant knowledge would survive. Planting a tree meant hope for someone they'd never meet. And through it all, they never sent a message to the stars begging for help. Not once. The council, watching from their distant station, grew more frustrated by the day. Their predictions were wrong. Earth wasn't collapsing. It was rebuilding on its own terms. And that was more threatening than any rebellion. Because if humans could thrive without the council's guidance. What did that say about the council's entire purpose? Doubt began to spread among their ranks. Younger members, who had only known peace and order, started asking questions no one had dared to ask before. What if the humans saw something we didn't? What if our way isn't the only way? But the elders shut those questions down fast. Chaos breeds illusion, they'd say. They're putting on a show. It won't last. Yet the show kept going. Years passed. The quarantine held, but Earth didn't break. Instead, it changed. Cities became smaller, greener, more human-sized. Communities made decisions together, not through votes alone, but through long talks under open skies where every voice mattered. Technology wasn't banned, but it was used carefully, only when it served people, not replaced them. And something else happened, something the council never expected. Earth stopped broadcasting its pain to the universe. In the old days, human signals had been full of noise, ads, arguments, fear, entertainment, war reports. Now the airwaves grew quiet, not empty, but intentional. Music returned. Real music played on instruments made from wood and wire. Stories were told again, not streamed, but spoken face to face. And when signals did go out, they carried something new. Songs of healing, poems about soil and stars, recordings of children laughing in clean rain. To anyone listening, it sounded like a species that had finally made peace with itself. But the council wasn't listening with open ears. They were listening with fear, because deep down they knew the truth: humanity hadn't failed the test. Humanity had exposed it. The council's offer had never been about equality. It had been about control wrapped in kindness. And humans, flawed, stubborn, beautiful humans, had seen through it. Not with anger, but with silence. Not with violence, but with dignity. And that silence was louder than any protest. Back on Earth, no one celebrated their victory. There was no victory to speak of, only survival and the daily choice to keep trying. People still got sick. Storms still came. Mistakes were still made. But there was a quiet pride in knowing they were doing it themselves without selling their soul for a shortcut. They didn't hate the council. They didn't even think about them much anymore. The stars were still beautiful at night, but Earth had become home again. Not a waiting room for rescue, but a place worth fighting for, every single day. And in that shift, from looking outward for salvation to looking inward for strength, humanity found something the council had lost long ago: the courage to be imperfect, and the wisdom to know that's enough. The council thought cutting off Earth would teach them a lesson. Instead, Earth taught the galaxy a new one: that true progress isn't given. It's grown, And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and keep walking. 2 years after the humans vanished from the moon, something strange began to happen far beyond Earth. At first, it was just a whisper, a flicker in the deep space comms network that the Council used to stay connected with its member worlds. Then another, small distant planets that had been quiet for generations, peaceful, obedient model members of the conquered, started sending odd signals. Not distress calls, not declarations of war, just questions. Who were we before? Why do our oldest songs feel like dreams we can't remember? What happened to the stars in our sky? The Council dismissed it at first. Glitches, they said. Emotional instability in developing cultures. Nothing to worry about. But the questions kept coming. And they weren't random. They all pointed to the same thing, memory. Lost memory. Stolen memory. What the Council didn't know was that before leaving the lunar base, the human team had done one last thing. Hidden inside the final Earth broadcast, a simple recording of wind through trees and children singing, was a pattern. Not a message in words, but in rhythm, in frequency, a kind of sonic key, built from fragments of music, language, and brainwave patterns collected from cultures the Council had erased centuries ago. It was quiet, almost invisible, riding on the edge of cosmic background noise, but to minds that had been silenced it was a spark, and sparks, given time, start fires. On the planet once called Vera, now listed in Council records as Agricultural Zone 7, a farmer tending genetically uniform crops suddenly stopped. She heard a bird sing a note that didn't belong. It matched a rhythm she'd never learned but somehow knew. That night she dreamed of towers made of light, of voices singing in a language with no name. The next morning she refused to work. Not with anger, just with quiet certainty. "This isn't my home," she told her neighbors. It never was. Word spread. Others began dreaming too. Old lullabies returned. Hand gestures their grandparents used, gestures with no purpose in their current lives, suddenly felt meaningful. They started gathering in secret, sharing fragments of memory like broken pottery, trying to piece together the shape of what they'd lost. It wasn't rebellion at first. It was remembrance. But remembrance is dangerous to those who built their power on forgetting. The Council sent envoys. Calm, reasonable voices offering support and clarity. They explained that these false memories were the result of neural fatigue, or cosmic radiation, or emotional stress. They offered treatments, gentle, painless procedures to restore balance. But the people refused. Not loudly, not violently. Just by stepping back, by closing their doors, by looking the envoys in the eye and saying, "We remember now. And we don't want your help." One by one, the quiet worlds began to wake up. Another planet, once home to a species that painted stories on the wind using magnetic dust, now reduced to mining operations, shut down its main processing hub. Workers simply walked away, returning to the high cliffs where their ancestors once stood. There they began rebuilding, not machines, but meaning. They mixed dust and rainwater, and for the first time in centuries, they let the wind carry color across the sky. A third world, whose people had once communicated through shared dreams, started gathering under open stars again. They held hands, closed their eyes, and waited. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, a shared image. A city of glass and song burning not with fire but with light. They wept. Not from sadness but from recognition, and in every case the same question rose like a tide. Who did this to us? The answer came not from the Council but from Earth. Buried in the same signal that carried the memory key was a second layer. Simple, clear, undeniable. It showed the Council's own records, the orders to pacify, the neural maps being wiped, the rewritten histories. No commentary, no accusation. Just truth laid bare. When the awakened species saw it, they didn't rage. They grieved. Then they acted. One by one, they cut ties with the Council. Not with weapons, but with silence, the same kind of silence humanity had used. They stopped sending tribute. They stopped answering calls. They removed Council symbols from their public spaces and replaced them with their own old signs, rediscovered in caves and buried ruins. The Council tried to reason with them. They sent diplomats, offered new promises, even hinted at force. But the awakened world simply replied, "You took our past. You will not have our future." And just like that, the foundation of the Concord began to crack. Trade routes that had flowed for centuries dried up. Member worlds that had once looked to the Council for guidance now looked to each other, and to Earth. Rumors spread. The humans saw the truth and walked away. They healed their world without your help. Maybe we can too. The Council's greatest strength had always been its image, wise, fair, above corruption. Now that image was shattered. What had looked like unity was revealed as control. What had seemed like peace was just quiet obedience. And the galaxy was starting to notice. Back on Earth, no one claimed credit. They didn't broadcast victory messages or say, "We told you so." They just kept tending their gardens, teaching their children, and listening to the wind. But deep down they knew. The silence they'd chosen hadn't just protected their own soul. It had given others a chance to find theirs. The Council, once proud and unshakable, now sat in their gleaming chamber, watching their influence fade like light at dusk. Their meetings grew tense. Accusations flew. Some demanded a show of force. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong all along. But it was too late for apologies, because the price of arrogance isn't always paid in blood or fire. Sometimes it's paid in trust, in respect, in the slow, quiet unraveling of everything you thought was solid. And as more worlds turned away, the Council realized the terrible truth. They hadn't just lost Earth. They'd lost the galaxy's belief in them, and that was a wound no technology could heal. 10 years after the humans walked away from the moon, a small ship appeared in Earth's orbit. It wasn't armed. It didn't broadcast demands or warnings. It just floated there, quiet and alone, like a question hanging in the dark. Inside was a single traveler, once a respected member of the Council, now an outcast. They'd watched their whole world unravel from the inside, seen trusted allies turn away, watched the great halls of the conquered grow empty as species reclaimed their voices, their histories, their right to choose. They'd argued for change, for honesty, for apology. But pride runs deep in old institutions, and the Council chose silence over shame. So this traveler came on their own. Not as a representative, not as a spy, just as someone who needed to see for themselves. What did we miss? When they finally made contact, just a simple radio ping, polite and hesitant, the response from Earth was calm. No anger, no suspicion, just a voice warm and tired but kind, saying, "We see you. Come down if you'd like. We'll meet you at the old landing field." The field wasn't grand, just a flat stretch of reclaimed land near what used to be a city, now softened by trees and wildflowers. No soldiers, no cameras. Just a few people waiting, farmers, teachers, engineers wearing simple clothes, holding nothing but cups of tea. The travelers stepped out of their ship, expecting judgment. Instead, they were offered water, clean, cold water from a nearby spring. Then food, bread baked that morning, fruit from a community orchard, soup made from vegetables grown in soil that had once been poisoned. They didn't talk about the past right away. They sat, they ate, they watched the sun dip behind green hills. And slowly the traveler began to understand. This wasn't a planet that had survived despite being abandoned. This was a planet that had healed because it was left alone. Not because humans were perfect, they weren't. But because they'd stopped looking for saviors and started believing in each other. Finally, the traveler asked the question burning inside them. Why didn't you fight us? Why didn't you send messages, demand answers, try to clear your name? The reply was simple. Because we saw what you really were, and we didn't want to become like you. There was no bitterness in those words, just truth spoken gently. The traveler stayed for weeks, not as a guest to be impressed, but as a student. They learned how to plant seeds in soil that remembered fire. They listened to stories told under starlight, stories not of conquest, but of care. They saw children solve problems with cooperation, not competition. And they realized something painful. The Council hadn't just failed Earth. It had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Before leaving, the traveler asked if humanity wanted anything, technology, knowledge, even just an apology. The answer came quickly. We don't need your tech. We don't need your apology. But if you ever meet others like us, species standing at the edge of a choice, tell them this. It's okay to walk away. It's okay to protect your soul. And silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the loudest no you can say. The traveler returned to a broken council, not with weapons or demands, but with that message. And with something else, A small bag of Earth seeds given freely with no strings attached. Back home, they planted them in the sterile gardens of the Council's central dome. At first, nothing happened. The soil was too controlled, too clean. But they kept trying, mixing in dirt from forgotten corners, watering with rain they collected by hand. And one morning, green shoots pushed through. It wasn't much, just a few leaves trembling in the artificial light. But to those who saw it, it was a miracle, because it proved life could grow even in places built on lies, if you were willing to change the ground beneath your feet. As for Earth, it kept moving forward. Not toward the stars, not toward power, but toward balance, toward each other. They never rejoined the galactic community. They didn't need to. They'd found something deeper than membership, belonging to their planet, to their past, to their future. And in time, other worlds began reaching out, not with offers or demands, but with questions. How did you heal your rivers? How do you teach your children to care? Can you help us remember who we were? Earth's answer was always the same. We'll share what we know, but you have to do the work yourself. No shortcuts, no saviors, just the slow, steady work of becoming whole again. The Council, once the center of everything, faded into history, not with a bang, but with a sigh. Some of its members joined the new networks of awakened worlds, humbled and changed. Others disappeared into silence. But their lesson lived on, that no civilization has the right to decide what another species deserves, even in the name of peace. And humanity? They became something unexpected. Not rulers, not heroes, just neighbors, quiet, steady, and real. They never forgot what almost happened. They taught their children the story, not to fear the stars, but to never trade their truth for comfort. To always ask, who benefits from this deal? What must I give up to accept it? Because in the end, the greatest gift wasn't clean energy or long life or galactic fame. It was the freedom to be human, messy, flawed, kind, and fiercely themselves. And that was something no council, no treaty, no alien promise could ever take away. So they lived, they grew, they remembered. And in the quiet hum of a healed world, they finally found peace, not because the universe accepted them, but because they'd learned to accept themselves.